that too many of us have been losing our rich cultures, including languages. Yet, while that past is important and should never be forgotten, we should never be bounded by the past. Our adverse economic, political, and social differences with the rest of the world can be changed by us. African agency and the drive for democracy and economic and social development should be stronger than any past or contemporary structure of oppression or injustice. So to talk of an imagined Africa is to talk of African agency in the effort to build better states that are peaceful, democratic, and economically and socially progressive. Hence I pose two questions. What are the contours of state building in Africa? What is African agency in the imagined Africa? I center my remarks on these two important themes of state building and African agency in our collective discourse on the emergence of Africa. First, what is state building? What are the elements of state building in Africa? In his seminal work on American states, Stephen Soronek argued that state building is most basically an exercise in reconstructing an already established organization of state power. Similarly, Francis Fukuyama observed that the core of state building is the creation of a government that has a monopoly of legitimate power and that is capable of enforcing rules throughout the state's territory. This is what happened in Africa under colonial rule. The states that were created under colonial rule were reified with African independence. However, we have seen that this Bavarian notion of state building is not enough. It leaves out the important economic and social needs and rights of citizens, without which state legitimacy is difficult to maintain or even justify. Since independence, we have learned that the state should not simply be structures of power, of authority, especially authoritarian ones, but also structures for economic prosperity and social well-being. In that sense, state building, which is sometimes referred to as nation building, also entails building the infrastructure for economic and social development. As Arnold Rifkin long ago noted, nation building in Africa is the process of defining the geographic area in which a particular state is to be built and developing the constitutional structure to give the state form and shape, the political system to give it life and provide the means for the population to relate to the state, and the economy to sustain the state structure and political system. What we have learned is that state building should not simply be a process of governing a state in a way, it should actually be the process of governing a state in a way that makes it a viable political and economic entity within the international system instead of becoming a failed state. This entails establishing a legitimate political system, maintaining the rule of law, and developing an economy that creates opportunities for economic and social well-being among the vast majority of the people. State building is a never-ending process, since both legitimacy and well-being are unstable and virtually inseparable elements of life that are contingent upon the real political and economic conditions of a state. However, state building can be deemed successful or a failure, depending on the extent to which the state has attained universally recognized standards of stability, political freedom, economic development, and social well-being. Too often, These include some level of industrialization, a fairly modern infrastructure, and access to basic social services such as healthcare, education, proper housing, clean drinking water, etc. Essentially, state building is measured by the extent to which citizens enjoy civil, political, social, and economic rights. State building doesn't mean that citizens have the right to a set of economic and social privileges that the state must provide for them for free. Rather, state building assumes that the state will create conditions for it to provide affordable essential services to ensure the social and economic well-being of its citizens, or foster an economy in which the vast majority of citizens have a realistic chance of securing their own economic and social well-being. These elements of state building were missing in Africa for most of the post-independence period, hence our differences with the rest of the world. While African countries have a long way to go to achieve the decent levels of political, economic, and stability, democratic governance, and economic and social development that we see in other parts of the world, there are signs of progress in Africa. An emergent Africa is one that is racing to catch up with the rest of the world and build better political, economic, and social conditions. An emergent Africa implies success in state building. Now, I want to share with you some data here, if Mo can let me. So let me share with you some of the data that is lending credence to the emergence of Africa. I provide these figures not to trouble you with abstract figures or to ignore the day-to-day struggles of people in the continent, but to add to the optimism about a better Africa and affirm that things can change and that we can change things for the better. As our brother said it, yes, we can. As you can see from the data here, GDP per capita in Africa as a whole has increased from $240 in 1970 to $1,700 in 2010. In 2000, GDP per capita was still $740. The big jump from $740 to $1,700 is what people are calling an emergent Africa. And this is data actually from the Economic Commission for Africa and the UNDP. There is a set of data which I'm actually showing you. We also see that annual GDP has been growing in Africa at a rate higher than the world average and at a rate comparable to that of developing countries in general. In 2008 and 2012, African GDP growth was at around 5%. The lowest growth rate during that period was in 2011 at 1.5%. And all 5 regions of Africa have had economic growth between 3.5% and 6.7% between 2012 and 2014. With an average annual growth for Africa at around 5%. The other good news is that private consumption made up the biggest component of real GDP between 2008 and 2013. Also, we see that the value of African export has increased from around $150 billion in 2000 to above $600 billion in 2011. Imports also increased at a similar rate. So yes, today Africa has relatively less external debt. Debt reduced from 54% of gross national income in 2000 to 21% of gross national income in 2011. And economic growth has indeed led to increase has increased income for people. Gross national income per capita grew from 1,600 in 1990 to nearly 2,100 in 2011, 2012. And plan on these statistics here. So this is actually the imagined Africa that is also improving the lives of people. The UNDP is projecting that human development in Africa will increase from 0.4 in 2010 to 0.65 in 2050. While that will be still below, it is a far better trajectory than what has happened in the past. And, understand that we always have questions about how the data is collected and what it means and the framings, which is a valid point. And I will get later on to the stories of people, so we can put some of these things in more human perspectives. So these are delightful figures that are making us believe in an imagined Africa. But Emmanuel Nusiri quickly reminded us this morning that we have been here before. Indeed, there are compelling and potentially worrisome similarities between the commodity boom economy in Africa during the 1960s and 1970s and the current mineral-driven economic growth in our imagined Africa. The challenge for us is how to make sure that this is for real and the mistakes of the past will not be repeated. We have learned from the past that mineral-driven economic growth without good political leadership will not lead to development. We have also seen that while democracy does not necessarily produce good leadership is hard to sustain without democracy. The question for us is how to make security, economic, and social changes in Africa. However, as we learned from Professor Loeff's and Professor Bakarr Bah's work this morning on race and international volunteerism in Kenya, African agency always risks being viewed with suspicion and even degraded. An imagined Africa indeed needs the support of all people. But an imagined Africa is more sustainable when African states, individually and collectively, take ownership for peace and security in Africa and uphold themselves to high standards of democracy and good governance. Similarly, an imagined Africa is more sustainable when African citizens, individually and collectively, take ownership of their economic and social well-being and drive creativity and entrepreneurship in Africa. Craig Calhoun defined agency as the ability to engage in autonomous social action and operate independently of the constraints posed by external social structure. Given the history of foreign intervention in African security and political matters, and the dependency of African economies, African agency needs to be viewed from both a historical and contemporary lens. Mustafa Nabaya and Anish defined agency as the temporarily constructed engagement by actors of different structural environments, which, through the interplay of habit, imagination, and judgment, both produces and transforms those structures in interactive response to the problems posed by changing historical situations. African agency calls for understanding of both the past and the present. But more importantly, African agency is about enhancing the ability of African states and citizens to engage, resist, appropriate, and adapt global political and economic structures for the advancement of peace, democracy, and economic and social well-being in Africa. One of the most difficult challenges for state building in Africa has been human security and good governance, which has been at the heart of the poor state of African economies and social well-being. Civil wars and corrupt dictators have stifled the positive energy and creativity of Africans. So what has the Emerging Africa been doing to enhance security and good governance? I must confess that we are a long way from meaningful success in promoting human security and good governance, given the violence that we have been witnessing in the continent: Sudan, South Sudan, Central African Republic, DRC, Mali, Nigeria, and so forth. So too, we continue to hear compelling reports of high-level corruption and rigged elections in too many African countries. African agency in promoting human security and good governance is limited. Yet, I want to note the effort of the African Union in addressing these problems through the African Peace and Security Architecture and the New Partnership for African Development, NEPAD. The African Peace and Security Architecture emerged at a time of growing and complicated violent political conflicts in Africa, and a renewed continental and global interest in democracy and liberal governance. The African Peace and Security Architecture was born out of the transformation of the OAU into the African Union. The African Union's Constitutive Act of 2000 established 17 key institutions covering a wide range of security, governance, and development issues. In particular, the Act shifted from the existing OAU policy of non-interference in the affairs of member states to a covenant of non-indifference to issues of human security and governance. It charged the AU with the responsibility to protect in situations of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. In collaboration with the continent's regional economic communities, ECOWAS, SADC, and so forth, the AU established the Peace and Security Council to actualize the new security doctrine of non-indifference in dealing with security, humanitarian, and governance crises in the continent, in Africa. The protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council entered into force on December 26, 2003. Since the establishment of the Peace and Security Council, several other institutions have been set up by the AU to promote security and deal with conflicts through the doctrine of non-indifference. These include the Continental Early Warning System, the Military Staff Committee, the African Standby Force, the Panel of the Wise, and the Africa Peace Fund. The Peace and Security Council and these other institutions collectively form the African Peace and Security Architecture. The adoption of the doctrine of non-indifference in African security and humanitarian affairs, and the effort to build political and military institutions to actualize the doctrine of non-indifference is an important step in the effort to assert African agency and ownership over the continent's security and the efforts of African countries to localize and partake in global legal governance. If the African peace and security architecture is successful, it will affirm Africa's emergence as a respectable member of the international community and soften the blows of neocolonialism in African security matters. My dear colleagues, the African peace and security architecture is a great concept for the assertion of African agency in its security and governance matters. However, the spate of conflicts rooted in ethnic political grievances and bad governance points to the AU's lack of capacity to actualize its vision for security and African empowerment in the application of the doctrine of non-indifference. Two problems continue to undermine the effectiveness of the African peace and security architecture. First is lack of credible political leaders. Very few heads of states have governed and left office in ways that are consistent with democracy and good governance. This makes the pool of candidates for the panel of the wise very small. The second problem is lack of money and logistical capacity. Few African states are really capable of undertaking or funding huge peacekeeping missions. This is clearly evident on the dependency on Western partners for funding and logistical support for the African Standby Force. While this does not totally negate African agency, it does constrain the emergence of Africa, that is, the owner and driver of its own security policies. In addition to the African peace and security architecture, the AU has undertaken some initiative to promote good governance. The doctrine of non-indifference relates to both African security crisis and the problems of governance that often lead to violent conflicts. While the AU's position on non-indifference to security issues is explicitly clear, the AU's policies of non-indifference towards problems of governance are a bit more subtle, yet equally important. The AU's policies on governance are laid out in its strategic framework for Pan-African socio-economic development, which is often called the New Partnership for African Development, NEPAD. NEPAD, which was established in 2001, rests on the AU's belief that the delivery of high-quality programs to promote Africa's development and regional integration can only be realized in an environment that permits good governance and corporate management. One of NEPAD's core goals is to strengthen the capacity of member states to ensure good corporate governance and management of development programs. The AU's insistence on good governance ties with wider international policies on democracy and good governance in Africa. The shift towards good governance was spearheaded by the IMF and the World Bank during the wave of democratic transitions of the 1990s. The AU appropriated the good governance discourse through NEPAD. NEPAD has been focused on enhancing management, procurement processes, accountability, and creating transparent government policies. The cornerstone of NEPAD's good governance policy is the African peer review mechanism, which is rooted in the doctrine of non-indifference. As the AU states, the African peer review mechanism is a mutually agreed instrument voluntarily acceded to by the member states of the AU as an African self-monitoring mechanism. The mandate of the African peer review mechanism is to encourage conformity in regards to political, economic, and corporate governance values, codes, and standards among African countries, and the objectives in socio-economic development within NEPAD. The establishment of the African peace and security architecture and NEPA are both efforts by African states to ensure African agency in the application of the international security and political doctrine of global liberal governance. Both of these are mechanisms that seek to simultaneously adapt to and contain the doctrine of global liberal governance and thereby ensure African agency in the imagined Africa. As I noted earlier, agency is not just about the actions of African states and the AU, but also the actions of people, the people of Africa. At its core, an imagined Africa cannot be sustained without engaged citizens who challenge, adapt to, use, and appropriate the political, economic, and social environment of African countries and the world at large to advance their own freedom and economic and social well-being. An imagined Africa can only be made for real by the actions of extraordinary, ordinary people, as Conde Rice will put it. These extraordinary, ordinary people are our brothers and sisters who have changed their lives through creativity, hard work, and persistence. And in the process, they have also transformed the lives of countless people in their communities and the continent. These are people who started with very little, but have done great things to advance peace and economic and social well-being. Boy?
Yes.
Please now. It's not a much. So my dear colleagues, please allow me to show you a few photos and share the stories of some extraordinary ordinary Africans who are the real agents of the imagined Africa. The stories I'm going to share with you are a few among many. You know some of the people from your own countries. This is not an exhaustive list of the agents of the imagined Africa, but just a few of the many people who embody Madiba's vision of peace, freedom, and prosperity for all, not just in South Africa, but Africa as a whole. To me, an imagined Africa is about the lives of people, not just abstract data, as I actually did before. First is Antoine Bigirimana of Rwanda. Antoine is a very successful entrepreneur and tech giant here in the United States, actually, who has taken his American success to Rwanda and Kenya. Like many of us, Antoine came to the US as a refugee, political or economic. Today, he's a leader in the tech world. More importantly, he's using his wealth and knowledge to help develop computer technology in Rwanda. Antoine is doing great in the US. He could have just continued doing well in the US. But he has taken his work to Africa so that he can help build better economies and enhance the social well-being of his people. As Brenda Sanya reminded us in our paper on e-technologies in Kenya, increased access to technology can allow us to caution and break old assumptions and practices that stifle progress. Second is Lebo Ngunguluza of South Africa. Lebo is one of South Africa's youngest self-made black millionaires. Yes, we know that millions of blacks in South Africa are in poverty, and only a few blacks have made it big. Still, we must be inspired by Lebo's story and understand that the Lebos are the true agents of an imagined Africa. Lebo is a strategist, motivational speaker, and a true entrepreneur. He's the founder of Gem Group, which has portfolios in publishing, television, media, technology, restaurants, hotels, and resort properties. He's also owner of U-Move car rental company in South Africa. Lebo is also a partner at Passport Co., which is a passenger transportation logistics and service company offering air charters, yachts, and armored and luxury vehicles. Lebo shows us that you can make it and be counted in that data on GDP and the other economic indicators of the imagined Africa. Next is Sim Shage of Nigeria. Sim is an e-commerce entrepreneur. He owns Konga.com and Dealday.com. Trust me, the websites work for real. Sim's idea is simple. Customers place online orders online, and he sends out an employee on the infamous tuk-tuk motorbike to deliver and collect payment. Sim started 5 previous online ventures. They all failed. But Sim said, I learned something from each and every single one. You just have to keep getting up and have no ego. And be willing to fail again and again and again. And let the only constant about you be your stubborn willingness to just get up again and again and again. Today, Sim is a real guy. Next on the list is Adama Amanda of Senegal. Adama is a true Afropolitan. She's the true Afropolitan in which a dangerous paper on African culture and our place in the world. Adama is a designer and entrepreneur. She is the owner of Adama Paris, a brand that bridges culture and empowers all women who refuse to be defined by one limited image of beauty, controlled by one brand and one culture. Next is Lona Ruto of Kenya. Lona founded EcoPost Recycling in 2010 at the age of 24. Her company turns plastic waste into poles and fence posts. Eco Recycling has created more than 500 jobs and eliminated over 1 million kilos of waste from the environment. State building is about taking action to enhance well-being. Lona is doing just that. As she stated, I grew up in a place where there was no waste collection. There was so much plastic waste. The sewage was encroaching into people's homes. The people in the area were desperate. Most of them were not doing very well economically. So even when I was still young, I would take some of the plastic waste and melt them and make ornaments and small things out of it to sell. Today, she is one of the people driving the imagined Africa. Another person is Tony Senaya of Ghana. Tony founded Horseman Shoes in 2012. He's manufacturing shoes in Ghana. And I tell you, his shoes looks good. Tony is Tony's goal is to make Horseman Shoes Africa's largest footwear manufacturer. Tony is an agent of the imagined Africa. Tony often tells people, I always wanted to be part of the solution to our challenges instead of sitting and complaining. Next we have Somalia, and Andrew Otieno of Kenya. Andrew and Teresa have been married to each other twice. First as husband and wife, and second as co-founders of Jane Academy Memorial School in Kisumu. I know them actually. They're my friends. So they won't mind. Andrew is a professor of engineering at NIU, that is not an university. And Teresa is a professor of education at NIU too. Teresa inherited a 10 acres piece of land from her mother, Jane, actually, with their professor salaries and fundraising mostly in the Caribbean. Teresa and Andrew have built an impressive all-girls boarding school that offers an education that is good enough for the richest and open to the poorest. Half of the students pay, while the other half are on need-based structure. Jane Academy Memorial School is built around Kenya's national syllabus and offers experiential learning through exposure to computer technology and eco-friendly, self-sustainable campus. I am a proud member of the U.S. Board of Jane Academy Memorial School. We are currently working with venture dairies to establish a barn at the school, which will provide milk for the school and the community and teach the students about farm and animal agriculture. Next is Raul. Raul is on that side, he's a male. Raul Camacho of Cameroon. When I met Raul in Kenya, he left a big impression on me with a simple idea. Start small, but think big. Raul is a physician and a public health practitioner. He's a co-founder of Pan-African Medical Journal, an open access journal officially launched in 2008. Raul's work speaks to the power of agency that Professor Zerai referred to in her paper on health in Zimbabwe. The mission of Pan-African Medical Journal is to create, stimulate, and perpetuate a culture of information sharing and publishing amongst researchers and other health actors of the African health scene in ways that contribute to availability of health information, better understanding of African specificities, and overall to improve health outcomes for the people and the continent. An African Medical Journal, which is now indexed in AIM, Google Scholar, EBSCO, Scopus, Embase, Global Health, PubMed, Central, Medline, and many other places, is pushing the boundaries of knowledge by making scientific knowledge produced in Africa equally valid and recognized in the general field of medicine. Raul told me that he started Pan-African Medical Journal after he and a colleague submitted a paper to an American medical journal while he was doing his postdoc at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. The editor of the journal told Raul that his paper is about Africa, even though its content was about health. So of course, it was denied. Just like all the other papers published in the journal, Raul's paper was about medicine, but he was told that it was about Africa. So Raul, again, the kind of person he is, he said to himself, well, I will publish it myself online. And he did. That is how Pan-African Medical Journal started. Today, the works of people like Raul counts as real medical works, thanks to Pan-African Medical Journal. Next is Archbishop Dedium Zapalania and Imam Umar Kobine Lamaya of Central African Republic. They are the inseparable peace builders. Their effort in this daunting conflict began when Imam Bamayya sought refuge at the residence of Archbishop Napalani after receiving death threats from the anti-Muslim militia. The two men have been undertaking peace drives across the interior of the country to reconcile Christians and Muslims. They remind us of our commonalities and what we can do together. Finally, I have Lima Moe of Liberia. Lima prayed the devil shall still back to hell. And he helped restore peace in Liberia. Among other things, she organized Christian and Muslim women to demonstrate together against warlords and the war in Liberia. She led the Liberian mass action for peace protest and the sex strike to end the war. She was recipient of the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize. So my dear colleagues, unimagined Africa can be for real. It is all in our hands. We are the agents of our destiny, and thank you very much.
Very much, Dr. Bah. Now we're going to open it up to questions. So, anybody have questions for Dr. Bah?
Thank you so much, Professor Bah, for that very comprehensive look at today's theme. One question that really keeps bugging me whenever I hear people talk about an imagined Africa is the issue of sovereignty in the 21st century. And I'm specifically disturbed by the ways in which American involvement, especially in the military sector, through AFRICOM, is so widely scaled. I think when I made a rough look, it seemed to me that the only countries in Africa that don't have any relationship with the US Army are Eritrea and Zimbabwe. What does this tell us about an imagined Africa in terms of our sovereignty and the kind of challenges that can easily happen again, especially with so much jostling on the global arena about the emergence of powers outside of the US trying to contest US hegemony?
Thank you very much. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your question, and I hope I didn't disappoint you. But I often really take a more kind of like pragmatic, realistic kind of approach to these questions of hegemony and sovereignty and I guess big boots. And that doesn't really mean that I am insensitive to the moral question, of global inequality and so forth. But I like to ask myself, how can you empower yourself? I mean, on every unequal relation somehow is a situation of imbalance in resources, what you can bring to bear on the situation. So I think the real question really is what can we do to empower ourselves? And I mean, the U.S. is a world superpower, and most of our countries are actually way far behind it. So just in terms of differences in resources, there's a big differences. But I think this is where the idea of an imagined Africa comes in important, because if we continue to empower ourselves, what will actually happen is that we will gradually increase our capital, and if we wish, capacity to resist foreign interventions, sovereignty violations, and so forth. So I mentioned the African Peace and Security Architecture, which is actually a very interesting, in my view, effort by the African Union to really appropriate global liberal governance. So instead of actually having, as usual, France, Britain, and so forth to come into being without even really consultation, what they have actually done is to try to create a mechanism where, most interventions somehow will, be channeled through the, I guess, some kind of consent from the African Union. Again, it doesn't really work that way precisely, but my point is that the way we can actually address these kinds of questions, which have been here forever and potentially can be here for a long time, is really to empower ourselves. And to empower ourselves means, in my view, to build better economies, to build better states. So, and then you can take a lesson from the Asian stories. They still also somehow complain of bullying. They also still complain of unequal relation. But you bet the intensity of that has actually reduced very much since the 1960s. Okay? So I think the ball is really in our court. Nobody's going to feel massive for us. Interstate relations really is not a relation of law. It is not really a relation of morality. I mean, if that is the case, I mean, a whole lot of things would have been actually solved. And I think, again, Madiba understood this, because what you see from Madiba is morality and conduct, and surveillance, So what we really need to do is follow the footsteps of people like this. Let's build our economies. Let's build our states' capacities. And if you do that, enough and long enough, I think things will change a little. So again, this is not a radical anti-colonialism, anti-colonialist kind of view, but I think I believe really you can empower yourself by actually having more money in your pocket and being able to do things yourself.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bah. The issue that bothers me as you were talking or giving the statistics about the emergence of Africa is the probability of sustenance and sustainability. Like Emmanuel said earlier today, we've been here before, and there is the tendency for the Dutch disease for African countries to fall again prey to the Dutch disease. A case in point is like Nigeria during the oil boom, I think in the 80s or late 70s, Nigeria was really right up. Now they're trying, but the economy is not as compared to how it was. And now if you look at Sierra Leone, we have the minerals, the diamonds brought the war somehow, but now we have the iron ore in the north. And gladly you are from Sierra Leone, I guess you know about that. There is so much going on now, the African minerals and the two great companies in India, London Mining and the African minerals. They are really mining heavily. There's so much coming out of the country. But the probability that the resources will be used efficiently is a major challenge. So my question is, the engagement you talk about, how can we, as maybe getting education, how can we participate in that engagement policy-wise to establish lasting institutions in these African countries so that the resources that are being harnessed are properly utilized for future generation, for sustainability? Thanks.
Yeah, so this is the real dilemma, and I think I agree with the point that was made before that we're being here. But I think we have to think of what can be different this time. And I think when we were here before, what happened was primarily two things. One is that you do have this kind of economies that were based on minerals and agriculture, prone to fluctuations in mineral and commodity prices. But the other thing also that happened at the same time was actually the rise in dictatorships, the retreat from democracy. So if you look at most African countries when they became independent, they somehow came through independence through a kind of a democratic constitution. Again, I have a lot of reservations about what democracy means and the way it's implemented. But the point is that they came out of independence with constitutions that allowed for elected governments, opposition parties, civil liberties, and so forth. And I think that was something that was supposed to be built upon. Now, what we actually saw was, the opposite of that. It is reversal to various forms of unaccountable government, which of course creates, poor leadership and bad governance. So you actually have the convergence of two things. That is, A, resources from mostly from natural means, and authoritarian regimes. That was a bad combination. Now, can it be different this time? I guess if the picture out there, everybody sees it through their own level of pessimism or optimism. But one way you can actually look at the picture right now in Africa is that, yes, there's all those troubles, corruption, and whatnot, but I think there's also a real civil society going on in Africa. Many African countries today have a fairly sophisticated civil society which really challenges government. Even in Sierra Leone, I know civil society can be corrupt, and they are. But there are a whole lot of people in Sierra Leone today who are constantly challenging government, from the civil society actors. That wasn't the case in the 60s or 70s. And typically, those are not people who are just easily thrown into jail. So my point here is that I think the difference really rests on whether we can, we as citizens primarily, not just have elections, but really continue to, the work of civil society to build, the kinds of democracies that are based on real elections, and also the two, ones in which citizens can hold government accountable. It is my belief that if we actually build that kind of civil society, what we will see is that yes, a lot of the mining companies will take most of the money, and a lot of the money, and the other half that remains for us, a lot of it will go to waste, but some will actually go to something. And I want to take a lesson from Senegal. Right? So when the old man was there, right, and you guys all knew him, but he never wanted to go. And this is actually one of the pioneers of NEPA. But if you actually look, what did the Senegalese do? They said, no, man, you cannot. And they resisted, And, it is almost like the kinds of revolution that you see in Eastern Europe. When citizens protest, nobody shoots somebody else. But yeah, they didn't let him do it. So I think, again, I don't want to really glorify Senegal here. But my point is that, civil society can do things. And I think Africa's civil society is a far much more healthy and better one than actually the one that we had before in the 60s and 70s. So that is where my hope is. It is really that informed, engaged citizen that can actually look at the president and say, we don't believe what you're saying. Can you actually show us the proof? Okay? Can block his motorcade and say you can't do anything about that. So that is what I think. That is what we need to combine with these kinds of resources. There are some things which currently we will not be able to change and given our current situation. If Sierra Leone doesn't accept the contracts of those two companies, bottom line and whatnot, so what's going to happen? We won't have any cash, for sure, and any other company from Australia, Brazil that is come, or China, the contract will not be anything different. Again, I'm not saying that it's the best contract, but my point is that the game is structured in many ways. And you have to learn to play with that and adapt that, and hope that tomorrow you can actually change it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bah. I think more than a question might just be a comment. If it happens that a question in the midst of that happens, please bear with me. But maybe to the entire audience in this conference, it's been very, very interesting to listen to all and to look at the interdisciplinary nature of the presentation over here, and taking from the type of knowledge, science, which is highly praised right now, but speakers here have actually tried to bring in all these taken for granted and relegated to the peripheries in terms of the curriculum. They've tried to bring it into the mainstream, the arts. We've had all of those things. And this is what Africa is about. And I made a comment with one of my friends to say, we're beginning to see, take the oral aspect of that was part of the presentation today, and look at these developed Western countries, how oral peace has been now held esteemed, and then yet there has been the base of our even building our own communities and so on. But maybe coming closer to what I really want to share with this house is the fact that as soon as we keep on entertaining how we are defined and all these new terms, all these new things that are bestowed upon us, and without us describing ourselves, it's like we continue to be an entity of study. And then Africa emerging, it's a phenomenon, it's right there. It's turning colors. What is the phenomenon itself saying and seeing within itself? So as long as we allow that happens. Two, I'm so much enthused by the stories of there are activities that are happening within the African continent. Here I'm thinking about African intellectuals. Where are they? What are they doing? People like yourself. We are so excited to have them. So maybe the next challenge will be up-and-coming scholars in this house. Do they really know where to go from here that is going to uplift Africa? Are they provided with home? Those who happen to have that zeal of getting back home, we know the stories. I can't go back there. But those who still see the light that all the expertise that I've gained abroad, wherever I am, has still a role to play back in Africa. But is Africa ready for such people when they return, such that they can make a contribution? It could be a region, it could be the very country where I come from, it could be the entire continent. So I think those are the challenges we are facing, so that when I graduate, I know all my choices. If I choose to go back, I know exactly if it's going to be regional. We start targeting our future careers whilst we're here. That if I happen to get back to Africa or to South Africa or to whatever, where do I intend making a contribution without having to wait who's going to open the door? At least the door only opens when you knock it. No one just opens up the door when there's no knock. So it's a matter of us knowing exactly where to knock and what is our vision as an individual. And then also, let's not forget that Africa is based on this communality, so to speak. We're people of communities. So when we take and be taken away by the sense of individualism, and you rise to the top all by yourself, and you even forget that as you climb up the ladder, there are people who are holding this ladder. So what happens if they let go of the ladder whilst you're up there? So we still can't live with that kind of notion. So I'm so happy to listen to this presentation because really that's the challenge, I think, as up-and-coming scholars in this house. We need to question ourselves. I'm so happy to see when people are beginning to write and they're publishing and so on, but really is that feeding into a bigger pot that Africa will tap into and continue to face and confront these challenges that Africa has to confront. Thank you.
That was a long comment.
Well, I'll take this actually to be a question more for you guys than for me. But I think there's an interesting question here, that is where do we go? And there's an even more practical, I guess more, basic question. So what do you do after you graduate? And I'll tell you, it's much more easier to answer when you look after time has passed. If I knew all that was going to happen to me since I graduated, most likely I would have actually gone back to Syria. And so when I go to Syria now, I see a lot of colleagues, and most of us actually tend to, at least most of the stories, people tend to remember the poor guy that hasn't made it anywhere. But I'm also reminded of my colleagues who, for some reason, the only option was to go back to Syria. And they went. And when I go back to live with my family and I look at them and look at myself, I don't see much differences. And I've been lucky enough in some little ways. So the lesson here, I think, is to be open-minded. And I think this is a basic question that we ask in education generally as an educator. We ask students, well, what are you going to do after you graduate with your degree? And this is even for American students. I always tell students that education really is not a static thing. It is a tool, and you have to learn to make use of the degree. And I think in a similar way, you can now, of course, I cannot go back, but I guess put Africa in your options, and don't fear it too much. You never know. So anyway, so that is my 2 cents there. On your question, actually.
Thanks, Dr. Bah, for your presentation. Yeah, I agree with you that success stories like this or initiatives like this are important for the development of Africa. But you may agree with me that also the impact are very limited in terms of scope. So before we reach the time that these experiences are widespread in Africa, so we may be thinking of, again, about the macro level, like I'm thinking about the state. And I carefully look at your charts and figures, and I have the impression that the growth slowed down in the 19th and 2000, and also in 2009, we know why, because the 19 to 2000 was, let's say, the height of the heat of structural policies, adjustment policies, we know that. And also 2009 was economic crisis. So I wanted to ask the question of, which is the following. Based on the impact of this kind of global contingencies of growth in Africa, do you really think that it is possible to sustain growth in Africa while relying on development aid? Because we know that those aids also come with functionalities that do not always work or adapt in our context, and that's very negative impacts on our economies. So, what do you think of that?
Thank you very much. I must confess that I'm not an economist, so I'll give you a layman's answer here. But a couple of things. First and foremost, the data that we present here, and the data like general, these are general data that is floating out there that somehow, supporting the view of an imagined Africa. This is not really my data. It is, So if you talk of imagined Africa, then this is what people point to. And I think this was discussed in the morning in a very useful way. And the real question really is whether there's a trajectory here or not. I'm less concerned actually with what the actual numbers are than the trajectory. Now, the point was made that, well, these economic cycles and so on and so forth. But, if you rise up to the point that when you go down and it has raised you one or two levels, that's fine. So I take an optimistic view that, this is a trajectory that looks good right now. My question is always, how do we sustain? And what are the options? If you look at the details of the African economies, a lot of the growth, of course, is fueled by minerals. We know that. But that is what we have for now, given everything around. The other thing is aid. You mentioned whether it is good and it is kind of like good or okay, sustainable to have an aid economy. Well, my simple answer is that when you at the time that you're getting it, make use of it. Make use of it at the moment that you're receiving it. I think what is even worse than actually having an aid-dependent economy is to actually not make use of the aid when you're getting it. That is even worse than actually just being dependent on aid. So, I'll go back to good governance, but if our resources are really one, minerals, and number two, aid, the question for us is how we collectively as individuals and also through the agency to make governments responsible, is how we can actually use it as a catalyst to be able to do other things. So if we have mineral resources, possibly if we invest them in the right kind of knowledge, industries, and so forth, maybe 20 years from now, as a guy from Ghana, he will be making shoes. That is one step forward. Maybe somebody else will be producing something else. So again, I guess I'm an optimistic kind of view. I'm an optimistic kind of person. But I do really want people to understand that there's something going on in this imagined Africa, and that thing that is going on really has to be captured and actually, I guess, run away with it.
Any more questions?
I will keep on questions.
Thanks for your presentation. There's lots of effort by many Africans just to make Africa develop, but one of the main problems we have is corruption, of course, poor governance and conflict. So as people who are passionate about developing the African continent, what do you think is the best strategy to combat these bottlenecks? Thanks.
So in my own works that I've actually done, corruption always comes up really as, like the source of many, many troubles, even civil wars. But what I also notice is that there are two really, I guess, levels or kinds of corruption, at least which I've come to make a distinction between. One is really what I call petty survival corruption, and typically it's a policeman taking the bribe, it's the clerk in the office asking for a bribe, those sort of things. And if you add all those bribes together, at best what they can do is to give him in a three-bedroom or four-bedroom house, and take his children to school and so forth. Then there are the other guys, the guys who somehow manage to divert $200,000, $100,000, something like that, from government coffers to actually private coffers. In Sierra Leone, there are some commissions of investigation after the military boys came to power and they did some kind of inquiries. One of the things that they pointed out was that if you add the entire salary of the past two presidents, that is Stevens and Joseph Saidu for more, if you add all together, it will not be enough to buy even a quarter of all the assets that they own in the country. Like if you add all their salary, it will not. So of course, that tells you what they have been actually getting money through other means, and they don't have any other jobs. So that means they are still in it. So these are really not just anecdotal stories. I mean, common sense can tell you. I mean, the person paid $200,000 $200, $300 driving in Mercedes, somehow there's some kind of disconnections here. So if you're really thinking of strategy, and a lot of African countries do have anti-corruption, certainly they have the Anti-Corruption Commission. Most politicians, what we tend to do is to focus on petty corruption, like try to harass the policeman for taking bribes and those sort of things. I want to see somebody who's going to begin from the top, worry actually about real corruption. So I think that is important because the impact of those are different. So I think corruption, yes, it is part of it. But again, so India has a very interesting kind of approach to corruption, when they punish not the bribe bar, but actually the recipient of the bribe. And the way they actually do it, if I understand it correctly, is that if you go somewhere, somebody asks you for a bribe, just give it to them. Then after that, you can go and file a complaint, and then they can you won't be charged for anything, but actually sort of person. Now, I don't want to give India a clean slate, but my point is that you can have a lot of creative ways to address these kinds of things. Okay? So it has to be creativity, and it doesn't really get solved in one day, but ultimately again, it is agency, and agency comes back to citizens. No ruler, very few, if there's any, will actually come here and be a prophet to his people or to her people. Okay? Somebody have to keep the fire on there. And the citizens are the ones that have to do that. Okay? So I think an informed, engaged citizen can go a long way to actually make government know that government works for the people. And if government knows that, a lot of things can actually change slowly. So that is just my own take on it.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Bah, for your presentation. We want to give you a token of appreciation, and we would like to present you with an award for your outstanding achievement and contribution to our community and African Student Organization. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
All right, and now we're going to go ahead and watch a video, just celebrate the people who we have lost.
It's not
this year. Thank you.
It's not
And I'm actually going to introduce more ghee.